I don't think it was Alexander the Great, but it was some describing an account of somebody who was marching their army past these massive walls, and they had no idea who had built them.
Mm,
It was like you were like two generations removed, say like 40 years removed from the existence of a thriving metropolis. These people had no idea what what had contributed to the creation of this thing, who had lived there, like what that
mm.
civilization was like. No idea. Part of me thinks that most people, without realizing it, are probably upset at their own weakness.
Well,
Well,
that's a personal
that,
problem. I'm using this as an example for like how do people figure out the big hairy goal. But
well,
you want to talk about something else, and I'm okay with that too, right? Because I think that
so
that's true. But outside of the big hairy goal question, yes, I agree.
so there's also this. So like what you were talking about earlier about like this the sphinxes. Like there may have been these
Mm,
more advanced civilizations before we even started recording history, and it sort of reminded me of a Dan Carlin episode of Hardcore History. You've heard of
mm,
this?
mm,
Okay, so he's a guy that did talk radio for like 20 years,
mm,
20 or 30 years. And he started doing like a history podcast. So he would I think his first hardcore history episode was on the similarities between Hitler and Alexander the Great. And
okay.
like what constitutes what you would consider like an acceptable amount of killing versus an unacceptable amount of killing. I may be misremembering the thesis
Mm-hmm.
behind it, but it was like, why do we remember Alexander the Great as this great guy when what we remember him for was conquering a lot of territory and expanding the expanse of his empire, which only lasted up until the end of his life, which was not very long.
Mm-hmm.
But Hitler, who accomplished much of the same thing, like many of the same, expanded the German Empire far beyond what it was right up until the end of his life. And like, right, why don't we have
Mm.
the same conception of Alexander the Great as we do about Hitler? So he was describing in one of his episodes, I think it was, I think he was discussing the Sumerians.
Mm-hmm.
And the Sumerians were this like if they existed in the BC era, if they existed in the before Christ era, and we still know their names, and we still have some idea of like what they accomplished and what the scale of their cities were. Like I think Sumerians were one of the first civilizations to have like a city with 1 million people in it, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about plumbing, you're talking about food distribution and
Right.
inputs. You're talking like healthcare to some degree,
Mm-hmm.
right? To whatever degree it was available back then. But when these massive civilizations crumbled, it was almost overnight, like in our conception,
Right.
right? I'm
Right.
sure.
Right. Right.
Oh no, we're being invaded. We can usually fight off the invaders because we're militarily equipped to do that. But
Mm-hmm.
oh, in the middle of a civil war at the same time, so we can't
Right.
find
Right.
a
Right.
model and civilization collapses. Right. And then
Right.
all of a sudden, nobody's taking out the garbage. All of a sudden, like nobody's importing the food, so you have to flee.
Yeah.
So he was describing an account that I don't think it was Alexander the Great, but it was some describing an account of somebody who was marching their army past these massive walls, and they had no idea who had built them.
Mm.
It was like you were like two generations removed, say like 40 years removed from the existence of a thriving metropolis. These people had no idea what what had contributed to the creation of this thing, who had lived there, like what that
Mm.
civilization was like. No idea.
Hmm.
And I think he was equating it to the it was that scene in Planet of the Apes, the iconic one,
Hmm.
where it's at the end of the movie where the guy goes to the beach and it's
Hmm.
like the head of the Statue of Liberty,
Hmm.
right? So it's this idea that is something that we could face, I think is very real, but at the same time, it's hard to imagine 40 years from now people not understanding how we got to where we are, you know?
Well, it's interesting. So I get roped into photographic evidence of the mid 1800s.
Oh yeah. Seen that YouTube channel?
Yeah, there's that stuff is pressing. It's good.
Yeah.
Like it's good. Like it's hard. It's hard to come up with hypotheses, right? That are alternate to the proposed idea of a mud flood, of something that wipes something out, and then we got to dig it out, and then when we dig it out, we realized there was more to the story, type of thing. And we just saw this actually in Pakistan. I don't know about the huge floods that they suffered last month. They weren't
Hmm.
just water floods; they were mud floods, and so entire cities just got buried. Like they're like it's just flat Earth now on top of them. Like they're gone, type of thing. So think 3 stories up, gone, right? And all anything that survived were think 4 stories and up. If it didn't get toppled down, so you got a building that's 4 stories up, but it's not, or it's only 1 story up, and so you're like, oh, I found a building. It's 1 story. No, it's a 4 story building.
There's a staircase that goes down for some reason.
Yeah, and there's so many um buildings in the United States specifically, right? So even if you just want to focus on the United States, never mind all of Europe and everything else, right? That there's they're finding when they tear up the roads and they have to like gut a portion of a city, you know, that there's a another floor that maybe was the first floor,
San Francisco and Chicago both have
type of
that.
thing, right? And it's like, what happened? Why? And the question is, well, how much do you really know of 1850?
Nothing,
Nothing,
basically.
right? You know what you're told in school, and that's it. Otherwise, you're living with what's presented to you today. You're not asking, well, why did all the technological advances happen in the last 100 years? But we know that Nikola Tesla, Edison, Tesla, like they were doing fantastic things with electricity, and now we're kind of like we get the benefit from that today, right?
Oh,
Obviously, right? They did this, and we get to do this, but that wasn't like, I still can't draw the line, So he coiled some wire around a magnet. Like, where'd that come from?
spun it really
And then
fast.
spun it. Like, where does that come from? Like, okay, what was the point before that? Right? What's the shoulders that they stood on to figure that part out? Because we stood on their shoulders to make an engine and an alternator, and then later, you know what I mean? Like, we can trace
Yeah.
that
90
line to
years
right about,
later, we're still using that.
we're still
Pretty
using that.
much unchanged.
Exactly. And it may not be the most efficient way to move electricity. They know they can move it through the resonance of the earth. They know they can move it through the ionosphere. They know these are facts, but there's no money in that. You could just plug your house into the earth. There's no money in that.
Man, can you imagine the socialist utopia we would have if you could plug things into the earth?
There's a guy on TikTok that does it, Dr. Parkinson, right? He built he's like the Tesla of our times in a way, right? He's kind of a weirdo. He built this ginormous transducer in his backyard, like a ginormous Tesla coil deal plus, right? And he's hyper scientific about what he's doing, but you're looking like the dude, are you building a nuclear reactor in your backyard? Like, what are you doing? It's like one of those type of guys, and then he there's a guy that was 900 miles away, tuned his little box to the same frequency, plugged it into the earth, and boom, lit his light bulb. Right now, was it all made up? Fuck, I don't know. But we do know that we do know that Tesla had performed that same experiment back in his day.
Mm-hmm.
He had a whole field of light bulbs just plugged into this, laying on the earth, right? To show that this thing he made could transmit energy wirelessly. And then they scrapped that. But the point is that what we know today and why we do things today is based on a series of decisions, and that were the competing ideas that were eaten of other ideas, regardless if the other idea was better, right? It just wasn't as profitable, right, or whatever, right?
Sometimes your marketing is better, and that's all that matters.
And that, for those kids in the back there listening, the only thing that matters is your marketing. You can do whatever you want with the marketing. But what I think happens is that like if in 1850 the hypothesis of these pictures were these buildings, these society, it was here before Columbus got here, and the savages of the American tribes weren't as savage as we think they were, and they were just the remnants of a previously collapsed civilization that had to go into the wild, and 2-3 generations later, right, are hunter-gatherers again.
Yeah, without a written form of language, you wouldn't have any. Well, no, I mean, because you've got, I guess if they had
because they got Cherokee, or the verbal, but they also got the written. They got the written because we used it was it the Cherokee, Navajo,
yeah,
we used Navajo, written Navajo and verbal Navajo as our first code, right? That couldn't be broken by the Japanese.
Okay, so what I was thinking was the idea that we have some of our, Jordan Peterson has said this, some of our fairy tales can be traced back tens of thousands of years, virtually unchanged. Right, because the way that people used to transmit information was to memorize it and to tell it to you, and then you would add whatever histories to the register that you had in your brain, and then you would transmit that. So I guess if you lost those people, there was your library. Your library was embodied in somebody who, if they died or become disfavored by their group. Yeah. Well, okay, so you were saying that in the 1850s, were you making the point that they were discovering elements of past advanced evolved civilizations?
I'm saying we finally have photographic evidence of large cities in 1850.
1850?
1850. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole timeline adjustment, which is a whole different issue, but in our measurement, for our reference point of today to 1850, right, going backwards in time, we finally have we have photographic evidence that survived that time, right? So it's the only time where I don't have to rely on somebody else's story to tell me what's happening, right? There's a picture. It was produced in that time frame, and it took a picture, There's several of these. There's like hundreds of these of major cities that are full up major cities in 1850 with nobody in the streets.
Okay, so they took these pictures in the 1850s, and the idea is that they are much, much older. Like, are we talking like buildings, or are we talking like earthenwork?
Buildings, like very nice buildings, very fancy buildings. That maybe perhaps this is the suggestion, right? The suggestion is this: that these cities have always been here, and at some point, we just populated the cities. Like once we discovered them, just like the same thing, right? Well, what is this wall? I don't know. What is the civilization doing here? Was there people here before? I don't know. And they start and they go in, right? And they go, well, look, they left all this stuff. So we'll just move in. And that was an alternative history than the one that's presented, which was this was nothing but wildlands with roaming savages of Indians, what we called Indians, right? And they had nations, Indian nations, and they did not advance over their entire time that they were here. But yet, a couple hundred miles south in Mexico, they built pyramids. But our Indians didn't do anything like that.
Oh, I think I remember hearing something about like American Indians in the southeast, in the southern portion of the United States, having built something like smaller versions of the Aztec temples. I seem to remember reading about that.
But I'm saying, like in our education, right? This is what we're taught when we're growing up, right? We're saying that these Indian nations are and they were sparse populated. They were there, but they were sparse. And so when we advanced Manifest Destiny, right, we had to fight some Indians along the way, right? We eventually had to control them, right? Trail of Tears, all that good stuff to make sure that we can do what we want to do, Manifest Destiny. That's a story. You know what I mean? They don't talk about what they found along the way between the sea to Shining Sea. You know, they don't talk about any of that. You know, they talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition, trying to find a path to Oregon. Right? Why Oregon? And how the hell did you know where Oregon was? And so, right? Like how like you're exploring the Midwest, but you know what's there already. You just don't know what's in the middle. We figured out that there's this blank space, and there's just a lot. Right? There's a lot that possibly could not have been the exact story being told, and then over time, a couple generations go through, and we lose access to these monuments, these cities. And maybe there weren't like 1,000 cities, maybe there was just a few, and right, several of these mega cities type of thing. And then we were able to, there's a whole thing about the World's Fair. If you ever see the conspiracy around the World's Fair, that ties into this.
What about it?
Like the World's Fairs, like the reason why we have World's Fair, like the reason why it was started was so that they could have all these massive things happen at these particular cities that were kind of always there, and then tear them down afterwards, saying that they were just temporary for the World's Fair type of thing. So that's the theory behind the world. Like, why was there World's Fair between this year and that year? It was to go to these older cities that had always been here and start erasing that history as best as possible. That's the theory, right? That's the conspiracy around it. So if there were cities here, right, sporadically, or like Chicago and wherever, right, and at some point people are going to start questioning, like 1900s are starting rolling around, like the new millennia, and they're like, oh, we're teaching these things and what we know is obviously different, so we're going to have to start figuring out something. And so the World's Fair is a solution to erasing that history in a systematic way. I don't know, right? These
I
are
mean, when was the first
these are the words
World's
that they're
Fair?
saying.
When was the first World's Fair? So I feel like I remember looking into this like a week or two ago, and the last World's Fair
Yeah.
was in like Kyrgyzstan or some shit.
Hey Siri, where was the first World's Fair? 1851. The great exposition of works and industry of all nations in London, the United Kingdom.
So like a celebration of modernity.
Yeah. In 1851, 1850. Right?
Yeah.
This, as I'm saying, like things happened in 1850 that kind of started a whole new, like there's previous 1850 and there's post 1850. And what happened before 1850 is now told to us by later people, right?